We have invited, part of the Lenten season, little miniature testimonies, 6-word stories about the roads we've traveled, and a few of those have been on the screen. So you still have time. I want to encourage you to write your own little 6-word story and submit them, and we'll be able to share a few of those as we move through this Lenten season. These are just succinct and suggestive tales that capture a little bit, crystallize something of the way our lives have lollygagged, meandered, or zigzagged towards goodness and love. I thought this is a great prompt and wound up writing several little 6-word memoirs myself. I'll just give you one of mine as we start today. So here's the one I'll share with you today. What? This? No. Wait. Maybe. Yes. There you go. So write your own. What will yours sound like? On several Sundays during the Lenten season, you'll also get to hear some road less traveled stories from other people. Today, Debbie Farrell will be sharing part of her story. Next Sunday, Alex Treaster will share some of his. And this turn towards storytelling is also a big part of our C3 groups. You've heard a little bit about that. So if you are inspired to hear the stories of others and to share your own, those C3 groups would be a great way to do that during this Lenten season. Our sermon series is entitled The Road Less Traveled, because while it's true that there's one hope, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all, that's Ephesians 4, while all that's true, it's not true that there's some singular way of responding to God's call on our lives. We might agree together that our shared goal is to follow Jesus Christ, but that path won't look the same for everyone. Some of us have gotten lost along the way and kind of liked it. Some of us have a bias towards adventure and excitement. Some of us prefer to wander away from the standard roads onto more scenic byways that twist and turn their way through the woods. Many of us have taken, either by choice or by necessity, the road less traveled, and this Lenten season can be a time for all of us to discover in a fresh way the wandering wisdom in all the very different ways that we follow Jesus Christ together. Now, a little caveat. By emphasizing the road less travel, we don't mean to pressure you to frame your story as outlandishly idiosyncratic or utterly unique, quirky, and contrarian. If that's you, fine, but if it's not you, that's okay too. We do want to create a large and open space for all of us to share our stories, however they sound, however they look, even non-standard stories. We want to create space for you to share your testimony, even if that testimony challenges expectations, even if your biography zigs when most other people zag. That's okay. That's what this season is about. Now let me give you a quick example before our scripture reading. Last fall, the seasonal leadership team, the group that was planning this sermon series for Lent, when we got together, our first version of this series the focus was a little bit different. Our focus was called, Can You Be Christian Alone? So we were talking about whether being Christian requires us to belong to a faith community. We were wanting to say that faith isn't individualistic. We were wanting to say that God usually calls us to follow Christ together by calling us into the concrete life of the gathered church as Christ's body. Now, this is all okay. It's pretty good stuff. This is a decent way to read the Bible. And we had the best of intentions to invite people to weave faith together with friendship. It didn't strike many of us as we were talking about this theme as all that controversial. But first, one person, and then a few others, raised a tentative hand. Several people then shared stories from their own lives about a time that to them felt rich in spirituality, rich in their life with God, before they were connected to any church or this church. Several people shared stories of times in their lives when they left the church or took a break from the church. These seasons of life lived outside the rhythms and the rituals of church community were important parts of their stories. And even though the standard story we Christians tell is that church is important, here were a few people wanting to say that their path in some ways feels a little bit different. And they weren't telling stories about some kind of raging rebellion against God. They didn't see themselves as having turned their backs on God, nor as giving up on the Christian faith. They saw these periods of their lives as times of healing and growth in the context of sometimes unhealthy or damaging church environments. I know that's hard to believe, that sometimes churches don't get things right. It happens from time to time. So by challenging our story that faith is always tightly tied to church life, they helped all of us see that our standard stories about the importance of the church were actually kind of rendering invisible the rich variety of different ways people actually experience God's goodness. We had a story up and running about how there's no way to be Christian if you're not tightly connected to a church community, and several people pushed back on that to say, well, my story feels a little bit different than that. My story sits at an odd angle to this majority story you're telling. And it was that kind of breakthrough moment in our conversation that led us to shift gears a little bit, where we wound up with this Lenten theme of the road less traveled. We wanted to take traditional Lenten themes of following Jesus Christ, so themes of discipleship, of journey, of pilgrimage together, and free them as best we can from all the assumptions we tend to make about how our stories, how our paths should go. So I want to begin our Lenten season in this series, The Road Less Traveled, with two readings, one from Mark's Gospel, then we'll have a moment for reflection, and then another by the poet Robert Frost. You can probably guess where that's going. So first now, listen for God's word to you from the Gospel of Mark. Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any of you wish to come after me, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, for the sake of the gospel, will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Whew. This is God's holy word for God's people. Thanks be to God. I invite you to take a breath or two, just take a moment and sit with what you've heard. And now another reading, a different reading. Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, and leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." Do you remember that one from high school? We had to memorize that in high school. So both Jesus, the crucified Lord of life, and Robert Frost, the American poet, draw our attention to possible paths. Jesus imagines at least two different kinds of lives. One is either unaware, uninterested, or unwilling to follow his, namely Jesus' lead. And then there's this other life that's determined to follow after him, to learn from him, to be his student and disciple. One kind of life hopes to avoid the difficulty and hardship expressed in that symbol of the cross. The other kind of life, yielding, perhaps even welcoming the heartaches and the struggles of life. One path amounts to a kind of grabbing, seizing, lurching at keeping a life, but then winds up losing the whole thing. Another path amounts to an opening of the hands, a relaxing of the shoulders, a taking of a deep breath, and a letting go that it sure looks like losing, but then it winds up having everything. Frost's poem also imagines a couple of different paths, but there's no divine call down one path as opposed to the other. As readers of the poem, we're pretty much left to our own devices, entrusted to our own instincts. As we stand at the fork in the road, we get to choose our path. Frost does think that there's something at stake in these fork-in-the-road moments. Knowing how life unfolds, how way leads on to way, as Frost puts it, it's doubtful we'll ever find ourselves at just this same fork in the road in the future. So what we choose today actually does matter because we're unlikely ever to get ourselves back here again. Frost has a bias, of course, for the road less traveled by. And the poem calls us to courage, encourages us not to default into the well-traveled paths. The poem warns us against conforming to the ways that all the crowds go. Opting against the popular or the standard route, says the poet, might, quote, make all the difference, though the poet doesn't share with us what kind of difference it would make. So Jesus' call to discipleship isn't quite identical to Frost's poem, but they rhyme a little if you listen. Map them onto a Venn diagram, and I think they share a few concerns. And I suppose one of the overlapping themes that interests me is this insight that living well, living with fullness, requires an openness to adventure and to surprise. Jesus calls us to follow him without providing any detailed map of where this might take us. Frost goes out of his way to express that you'll have to choose your path without knowing what's around the next bend, let alone where this path will ultimately take you. Most of us know that we're supposed to embrace adventure and surprise, and yet much of our energy often gets spent protecting ourselves from surprise by planning for as much predictability as we can. So friends, I'm wondering what might become possible during this Lenten season if we were to hear Jesus' invitation to discipleship as a call to set out on an adventure. As open as we can be to surprise, as free as we can be from worries about conforming to others' expectations for our lives and what our path should look like. Notice a couple of things about this invitation to follow Jesus. First, it's an invitation to welcome a life of specific sacrifice, of purposeful humility, and labor-intensive care for other people. Now, this is what we often focus on or think of first when we hear this call from Jesus to take up our cross and follow him. We immediately begin thinking about the cost and the pain. Whoa, doesn't sound very appetizing. And we're not wrong. Following Jesus might in fact be costly. Might cost you time, might cost you money, it might cost you even some of your cherished dreams. I don't know. And it will feel like you're losing at times. And yet, whoever loses their lives for the sake of following Jesus will get it back, and more besides. So the cross-shaped life we're invited to is not a life bereft of happiness and joy. It's a deeply satisfying life, a rewarding and connected way to live with others that shares in God's secret work of transforming the whole world into a place of care and kindness. But notice one more thing about this invitation to become his learners, his students, his disciples. Notice that Jesus does not invite us to take up his cross. Jesus doesn't even invite us to take up the cross as if there were one singular generic way of following him. you are to take up your cross. In other words, you are invited to accept, welcome, and embrace the particular difficulties and challenges that will make your life what it is. Following Jesus is always a road less traveled, not because it's a life of suffering as opposed to a life of ease. Everyone's life will be hard in its own way. Following Jesus is a road less traveled because we're invited to let go of our childish dreams for an easy life. We're invited to let go of these naive hopes for a life without friction or without stress. In this way, to take up our cross and follow Jesus has nothing to do with volunteering for new ways to suffer. That's not discipleship. That's a masochistic martyr complex. And that's not what Jesus invites you to. Rather, as Jesus' disciples, we leave behind our silly fantasies of the easy life and begin to bear the bumpiness of life without complaining. We learn to approach struggle and stress as one more ways we offer our lives in praise to God and in service to others. Judson Brewer has a book. It came out in 2017. It's got a long title. So here's the title: The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, Why We Get Hooked and How We Can Break Our Bad Habits. Long title. It's a pretty good book. The way he opens the book in the introduction, it's simple, short, and to the point. He suggests that we have the brains of a sea slug. The sea slug has, quote, one of the most basic nervous systems currently known, a mere 20,000 neurons. That sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot. You have a lot more than that. The sea slug utilizes a very basic two-option approach to learning and to laying down memories. And here it is, quote, move toward nutrient, move away from toxin. That's how a sea slug lives. Move toward nutrient, move away from toxin. Now, if you're not offended yet by being compared to a sea slug, hold on, it gets worse. Brewer goes on to suggest we might even have the basic survival mechanism of the single-celled organisms like protozoa, who lives by the same survival strategy. If it's attractive, go towards it. If it's unpleasant, move away. Now, Brewer doesn't think that human beings can be reduced to sea slugs or protozoa, but he does wonder if we continue to take some of our evolutionary cues from these lower organisms. So he writes this, quote, could some or much of our behavior be attributed to deeply embedded patterns of approaching that which we find attractive or pleasant and avoiding all that we find repulsive or unpleasant? And if so, can this knowledge help us change our daily habit patterns? And he's willing to help you unload all kinds of bad habits, from simple quirks to stubbornly ingrained addiction. And then this line, perhaps might we even discover a new way of relating to ourselves and others, one that transcends this basic nature and ironically has always been available to our species, that which makes us uniquely human, end quote. Now, Brewer is a neuroscientist, a researcher at Brown University in their mindfulness program, and so you won't be surprised that he goes on to suggest in this book that this new way of relating to ourselves and others is a way of life called mindfulness. I don't disagree with him, but another name for that new way of relating to ourselves and others might be called the way of Jesus, the journey of faith, or the path of discipleship. Discipleship is always counterintuitive, paradoxical. You can't ever come at it quite straight. It requires welcoming this truth at a slant. Do you want to salvage your life? Great, then give it away. Do you want to find deep joy and profound satisfaction? Wonderful, then accept the pain that's part of your life and part of all lives. Do you want God to place you in a wide and spacious place? Good, then opt for the narrow path. That sliver of an opening you have to squeeze through, perhaps scraping your cheek, tiptoeing along a rocky ledge on a trail that bends around a corner into the unknown. Every Sunday when we gather, we welcome one another into worship with a reminder that God welcomes and loves all of us, even though our experiences, our identities, and our pathways are unique. And I know that if you've been here every Sunday, you know this welcome. You could probably say it in your sleep in some way or another. Every Sunday we say, here at Second, we're young and old, we're gay and straight, we walk, crawl, roll, we have different socioeconomic experiences, different faith journeys, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes we add some things to that. But all of us are loved by God. I've had a number of guests and visitors to Second mention to me that this purposefully pluralist welcome up front in our service is what got their attention and made them think, this might be the kind of place where I could belong. I really like this welcome because it names a value and an aspiration that life with God doesn't smooth out all of our unique edges and fashion us into sameness, that we can follow Jesus Christ together into deeper, healthier expressions of our own unique callings. And as a congregation, we're doing our best to provide a wide array of experiences for growth, opportunities for service and connection that respect all these different ways that we're wired, our different schedules and energy levels, our unique family situations and emotional needs, our various interests and passions. So no matter who you are or how you got here, no matter whether you're a long-committed follower of Jesus Christ or someone just barely and tentatively starting to experiment with a new spirituality, no matter whether you're in fourth grade or your 40s or far, far older than that, no matter where you are on this spectrum of extroversion and introversion, God is inviting you to either begin or to deepen your life as a follower of Jesus Christ. This means, friends, that you and I, we have all been invited onto a path of nonconformist adventure. You will need to release your need to blend in, fit in, or resemble someone else. You will need to release your need for control and predictability. You will need to release your dreams for an easy life, for a stress-free life, for a life without struggle. No matter who you are, your calling during the season of Lent is to take up your cross, not anyone else's, and certainly not the cross that Jesus bore for you, but to take up your cross, to embrace all that's uncomfortable and unwanted and annoying about your life as part of the big, messy life you've been offered, and then to offer it back to God and to others as the only gift you have to give. Amen.